The morning he called, the sky was still dark, the kind of blue that doesn't belong to night or day. The house creaked once, slow and tired, as if the wood itself remembered too much. Coffee steamed on the counter. The clock ticked without hurry. For years, that was the only sound I trusted time moving, even when life didn't. 5 years earlier, my son walked out of this house and took every sound that mattered with him. Since then, I've lived with the smaller ones. The sigh of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the breath of an old dog dreaming by the window. That's how silence teaches you. It doesn't heal, it just makes you listen. The phone buzzed once, then again. When I turned it over, his name stared back at me. Ethan. My hand paused mid-air. Habit, guilt, love, maybe all three made me swipe. His voice came through steady, but strange. He talked about a business partner's investors. Then he asked for my name. On a loan, $80,000. I didn't say a word at first. Just listened. The distance between us wasn't miles anymore. It was choices. And in that silence, I understood something. Some things don't end when people stop talking. They end when someone finally decides to listen. The house made a small sound before dawn, the kind of creak that comes from old wood remembering too much. The house made a small sound before dawn, the kind of creak that comes from old wood remembering too much. I woke up before the first light touched the blinds, as I always did. There was no alarm clock, just the rhythm of habit. Men like me, we don't sleep late. Maybe it's the silence that keeps us awake, or maybe it's the years that won't let go. I brewed the first pot of coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, dark and sharp. The same brand my wife used to buy, though she always added sugar and cream. I never did. The light above the sink hummed softly. The walls looked pale in that yellow glow, the way they do when a house has seen too much life and too little laughter. Outside the yard was a mess of orange and brown leaves. The oak trees had started to give up their color early this year. The world changes faster when you live alone. Cooper. My old Labrador slept under the window. His breathing was the only heartbeat left in the room. It had been 5 years since my son left. 5 years since he slammed the door and told me I'd stolen what was his. He meant the money, the trust fund his mother had set up before she died. She wanted him to be 30 before touching it. She said it was the only way he'd learn to earn before he inherited. I agreed because she was right, but I never told him that. I thought silence was the right kind of love. The night he left is burned in my mind. He was angry, pacing across the living room, shouting things he didn't mean, but half believed. I stood there saying almost nothing. I remember the sound of rain outside his footsteps pounding down the stairs, the headlights sweeping across the wall as he drove off. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her face turned away. I watched until the tail lights disappeared, then stood there long enough for the coffee to go cold. After that, the house felt hollow. I still sent him birthday cards, sometimes with a note, sometimes with just my name. No answer ever came. At first I called, then less and less. Eventually I stopped. A man can only talk to silence for so long before he starts to believe it's the only thing listening. That morning I was halfway through my cup when the phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't look right away. Calls that early are never good news. When I finally turned it over, the name on the screen froze me where I stood. Ethan. For a long second, I couldn't move. My hand hovered above the phone like it might vanish if I touched it. The last time I'd seen his name flash on the screen was the night his mother passed. He'd called to say he couldn't make it home. Too much going on, he said. Then nothing for years. I answered before the call went to voicemail. His voice sounded different. Older measured, but there was still something guarded in it, a stiffness that didn't belong to the boy I remembered. He said hello, quiet and flat. I said his name just once. He told me it had been a while. I said 5 years, give or take. Neither of us laughed. He went on about a business he was starting, a new venture, something to do with marketing and technology. He said he had partners, investors, big plans. His tone was professional, like a salesman making a pitch. I let him talk. Then he said he needed a co-signer for a loan. $80,000. He said the bank only needed a signature, that it was just paperwork, nothing more. The number hung in the air like smoke. I watched the light from the window shift across the table, touching the frame that held his Little League photo. 10 years old, missing a front tooth, smiling at me with a face that didn't know what failure meant yet. I could still hear his voice from that day he hit his first home run. You see that, Dad, I did. I always did. Now, 5 years of silence later, the same voice was asking for my name on a line of credit. I wanted to ask where he'd been, if he was still with Clara, if he'd ever forgiven me. Instead, I said nothing. My hand tightened around the phone. Why me? I asked at last. He hesitated. Because you're my father. The word hit harder than it should have. Father. As if saying it could make the past behave. He told me it was just a formality, that I wouldn't have to pay anything. He said it like a man who'd already convinced himself it was true. I took a breath. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window. The same tired eyes, the same silence that had ruined more than one good thing. All right, I said. He exhaled, and for a second, I thought I heard relief. He thanked me, promised to send the documents. I said to take care of himself. Then the line went quiet. After he hung up, I stood in the middle of the kitchen, the phone still warm in my hand. The house seemed even quieter than before, as if the sound had gone somewhere else and taken the air with it. The coffee had cooled. Cooper lifted his head, looked at me once, then laid it back down. I stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the yard like restless thoughts. The clouds were heavy low, carrying the smell of rain. Somewhere beyond them was a son I hadn't seen in half a decade, asking for help, but not forgiveness. I thought about calling him back, about asking if he was okay, if he still hated me, if he remembered the sound of this house. I didn't. Some words have to wait until you can say them face to face. Inside, I poured another cup. The clock on the wall ticked in steady rhythm, the same circle, the same path. I looked at the empty chair across from mine. That chair still faced the window every morning. My wife used to sit there and tell me what was worth worrying about and what wasn't. You'd know what to say to him, wouldn't you, Mary? The words slipped out before I could stop them. I waited for an answer that didn't come. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator, the sound of a life that had learned to move without conversation. I sat down, stared at the phone, and let the moment settle. 5 years of silence couldn't end with a signature. Maybe it had to start with something smaller. Maybe with me sitting here again waiting. Outside, the rain began to fall. The kind of rain that didn't rush, just stayed. Rain came softly through the night, a quiet patter against the windows that stayed long after I'd stopped listening. When I woke, the air in the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. I sat at the table again, coffee in hand, watching the faint light crawl across the kitchen. The chair across from me was still empty. It had been that way for 7 years. By morning, the storm had passed, but the sky was still gray, thin, and low. I drove into town for groceries, though I didn't really need anything. The The grocery store was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own footsteps. I saw a young father lifting his daughter to grab a box of cereal, her laughter echoing down the aisle. It was such a small sound, but it stayed with me. There are some sounds that don't leave. Back home, I opened the laptop again. The email from Ethan waited at the top of the inbox, unread, but not unseen. His words were short and careful, all business, no warmth. He wrote that we could meet same cafe as before, downtown Detroit. I read it twice. The place had once been a family ritual back when Sundays meant something. I stared at the message until the letters blurred, then clicked reply. I told him I'd be there. The next morning, I stood in front of the closet longer than I needed to. Most of my clothes had been the same for years, worn soft by time. I picked a blue checkered shirt, the one Mary always said brought out the color in my eyes. I hadn't worn it since her funeral. I held it for a moment before putting it on. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and old memory. The drive to Detroit was quiet. The radio stayed off. The highway stretched out ahead, slick with last night's rain, bordered by trees that had already begun to turn. I kept thinking about the last time I'd made this drive. Ethan had been in the passenger seat then, feet on the dashboard, humming along to a song I didn't know. I had told him to turn it down. He laughed and turned it up. That was before everything between us started to break. The cafe was still there, tucked between a laundromat and an old bookstore. Its sign leaned slightly now, paint faded from years of sun and snow. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls, just as it always had. The same woman stood behind the counter, her hair now streaked with gray. She didn't recognize me. That felt right. I chose the same table near the window, the one where Mary used to sit beside me, while Ethan ate pancakes drowning in syrup. I remembered the way she'd tease him about eating too fast, the way he'd grin with his mouth full. For a moment I could almost see them both there again, the sound of laughter layered over the hum of conversation. Then the bell above the door rang, and the ghosts faded. Ethan stood in the doorway. He looked older, leaner, sharper around the edges. His clothes were nice, the kind that didn't belong to the world I lived in anymore. His eyes searched the room before they found mine. For a moment he hesitated, and I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would swing his legs under this same table while asking for another muffin. Then he blinked, and the man standing there was someone I didn't know. He walked over his steps, steady but cautious. I rose, unsure whether to reach out. He nodded once, said my name softly, then sat down. I sat too. For a while we didn't speak. The waitress came, filled our cups. I thanked her. He didn't. I asked how he'd been. He said fine. I asked about work. He said busy. The words hung there like smoke light, but choking. He began to talk about a business he'd started, a marketing firm in Chicago. His voice grew confident as he spoke, the rhythm practiced like someone giving a pitch to a room full of strangers. He mentioned partners, investors, clients. I listened, though I could hear the strain beneath the polish. His fingers tapped against the table, a restless rhythm that betrayed him. Every so often his eyes flicked to the door. Then the bell rang again. A woman entered, her reflection catching first in the glass before I turned. Clara. She hadn't changed. Still precise, still beautiful in a way that left no warmth. Her coat was beige, her movements calm, like someone used to being in control of every room she entered. She saw me, smiled politely, and joined us without waiting to be invited. Ethan shifted in his seat. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, and his tapping stopped. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Halford," she said. Her voice was smooth, professional. I nodded. She started explaining the company, her tone efficient, her eyes direct. Ethan followed her lead, nodding as she spoke, adding details where needed. They sounded well rehearsed. When she finished, he reached into his bag and took out a tablet. He said the bank had approved the loan. All that was left was my co-signature. He said it like it was a small favor, nothing more than a name on a line. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I looked at him. Really looked. His jaw was tight, his hand still hovering near hers, his eyes avoiding mine. "What exactly does the company do?" I asked. He launched into an explanation about digital campaigns and brand strategies, phrases that meant little but sounded important. Clara added something about growth projections. The words flowed smoothly, but there was something hollow underneath them. I sipped my coffee. It had gone cold. He leaned forward, then his voice lower, softer. "I know I've made mistakes, but this is different. I just need someone to believe in me again." That word again sat heavy in the air. I remembered the last time he'd said it. He'd been 17, standing on the baseball field, dirt on his hands, eyes bright with defiance, after striking out 3 times. "Believe in me again, Dad. I did then. Maybe I always had." I nodded slowly. "Send me the details. I'll look them over." He let out a breath. Maybe relief, maybe something else. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes unreadable. They stood. He said he'd send the documents that evening. I said I'd wait for them. He looked at me for a moment longer, as if wanting to say something, then turned away. As they walked to the door, the bell rang once more. For a heartbeat, I thought he might turn back. He didn't. Their reflections passed over the window glass, blurred by the gray light, and the rain starting to fall again outside. I stayed seated long after they were gone, my hands wrapped around the cup that had long since lost its warmth. The waitress asked if I wanted a refill. I shook my head. Outside, the rain gathered against the glass, tracing thin silver lines down the pane. I kept holding the cup anyway, as if warmth might return if I waited long enough. The drive home was long and quiet, the kind of silence that fills every corner of a man's thoughts. The road shimmered under the drizzle, each passing car flashing a moment of light that vanished too soon. I tried to focus on the white lines ahead, but Ethan's words kept circling in my head. He had said he needed someone to believe in him again. It wasn't what he said that lingered. It was how his voice broke when he said it. By the time I reached home, the rain had stopped. The house waited in its usual stillness, lights, dim air, heavy with the smell of rain-soaked wood. Cooper lifted his head when I walked in, gave a single wag of his tail, and went back to sleep. I poured myself a drink I didn't want, and stood by the window. Outside, the yard glistened under the streetlight. The wind pushed a few yellow leaves across the porch, whispering against the boards. For a moment, I thought I heard Mary's voice again, telling me not to lose faith in our boy. The phone buzzed. A new email from Ethan. The subject line read, "Loan documents." His message was short. "Thanks again, Dad. I promise this means more than you know." I clicked the link. The page loaded clean and fast, all soft blues and gray text. Lines of financial language I half understood filled the screen. Joint application, liability terms, collateral. Each word blurred into the next. I scrolled, watching the cursor blink beside my name. Another notification appeared. Clara had joined the document. Her initials sat at the corner of the screen, neat and precise. A message box opened. She typed, calm and efficient. "Everything is ready, Mr. Halford. Just a quick verification and we can finalize. Ethan's counting on you." The blue light from the screen washed over my hands, turning them pale. For a second, I didn't recognize them. They looked older, thinner, as if the years had been waiting for this moment to show themselves. Then another message appeared. From Ethan. Appreciate this, Dad. Sorry for the mess before. You won't regret it. There was a typo in the word before. He always made that mistake when he was nervous. I stared at the screen at that small imperfection, and for a brief second I saw the boy he used to be. The one who would scribble notes for his mother and misspell half the words, laughing at himself when she corrected him. I took a deep breath. The cursor still blinked. I thought about the trust fund, the one Mary set up for him years ago. She wanted to protect him not from life, but from the version of himself that rushed too fast, believed too easily. Maybe this was her test. Maybe this was mine. I clicked sign. A small tone followed, sharp and clear, like the sound of a nail being driven into wood. The confirmation box flashed once, then disappeared. For a long time, I didn't move. The screen dimmed, reflecting my face back at me. I looked at that man in the glow of the monitor, realizing I had just tried to rebuild 5 years of silence with a single click. I turned off the laptop. The room sank into darkness. Only the clock in the kitchen kept its rhythm steady and indifferent. I finished the drink I hadn't wanted and poured another. It tasted of burnt oak and regret. I went upstairs, each step creaking under my weight. Outside Ethan's old room, I hesitated. The door still bore the faint shadow of the name he'd once painted there in blue, long sanded away. I opened it slowly. The room smelled faintly of dust and cedar. The bed was neatly made. A photo frame sat on the desk, the one I hadn't looked at in years. Mary and Ethan on the porch steps, summer light across their faces. He was 10 then, missing a front tooth, one arm slung around her shoulder. I picked up the frame. The glass was cool beneath my fingers. In that photo, they both looked alive in a way the house no longer did. I set it back, straightened its edge, and stepped away. Downstairs, the phone buzzed again. Another text from Ethan. Thanks, Dad. Clara says everything went through. We'll send updates soon. I typed a reply, then deleted it before sending. There was nothing to say that didn't sound small. I walked back to the kitchen, set the empty glass on the counter, and listened. The rain had started again, light and constant. A loose branch outside brushed the siding, a faint scraping sound that rose and fell with the wind. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that a father's job is to trust even when it hurts to, that this was a bridge, not a trap. But as I stood there, the air felt too still. The light from the window flickered, as if the world outside had blinked. I could still hear that digital tone in my head, sharp and final, like something sealing shut. When I turned off the lights, the house exhaled into darkness. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, counting each tick of the clock. Somewhere beneath the rhythm, I thought I heard another sound, softer but unmistakable, the faint crack of glass shifting under pressure. It wasn't loud enough to wake anyone, but it was there, small and certain. The beginning of something breaking. The morning began like any other. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, the faint sound of rain tapping against the window. Cooper slept by the door, his breathing steady and soft. I sat at the table staring at a small pile of unopened mail, the kind that collects when life feels too still to matter. Bills, advertisements, charity letters. Then one caught my eye, a thin white envelope with the bank's logo in the corner. I slit it open with the dull knife that had lived in the drawer for years. Inside, neat black print on bright white paper. Payment overdue. I read it twice before setting it down beside my cup. Probably a mistake, I told myself. Computers get things wrong all the time. A week later, another arrived. Then another. By the fourth, the excuses started to sound hollow even to me. When the fifth one came, I didn't open it right away. I knew what it would say. I made a call instead. Ethan's number rang, then stopped. His voice came through that same voicemail recording from years ago, cheerful, and too young for the man he was supposed to be. I left a message anyway, told him to call me back. No reply. I tried Clara next. The number was disconnected. Only a tone, then silence. The next morning I went to the bank. The woman behind the counter smiled when I handed her my ID, but her expression changed as soon as she saw the account pulled up on her screen. Her polite professionalism shifted to caution. "Mr. Halford," she said, "your son's account is listed as delinquent. Because you are a joint applicant, the responsibility for the balance falls on both parties." She kept her eyes steady, the way people do when they've had to give bad news too many times. "May I have a copy of the contract?" I asked. "Of course." The printer whirred, spitting out crisp sheets of paper. She stapled them, neatly tapping the corner twice before sliding them across the counter. The sound echoed too sharply in the quiet room. I thanked her and walked outside, the weight of the papers heavier than they should have been. In the car, I unfolded the top page. My name was there, printed clean and clear, right beside Ethan's. Below it, a timestamp marking the day I'd signed. Every clause sealed, every obligation legal. My hand trembled slightly as I read the word liability. Rain started to fall soft at first, then harder, beating against the windshield. I sat there for a long time, watching the drops race each other down the glass. I couldn't tell if the shaking in my chest was anger or shame. When I finally drove home, the house felt emptier than usual. The envelopes were still on the table, a small pile of evidence. I spread them out one over the other until the words blurred. Cooper stirred at the sound of paper moving, but didn't get up. I poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the contract again. Each page seemed cleaner, colder, more final. I'd done this to myself. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in the dark kitchen listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train passed. Its low horn carried through the night, long and mournful. I thought of Ethan as a boy running in the backyard with his toy trains, his laughter cutting through summer air. Now it was just the echo of that sound that remained. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I packed a small bag, filled the gas tank, and set out for Chicago. The road stretched straight ahead, gray and slick. The radio played static until I turned it off. All I could hear was the rhythm of the tires on wet asphalt. The city appeared hours later, its skyline rising out of mist. The address on the contract led me to a narrow street in Fulton Market, the kind of place that had seen better days. The building looked newly painted, but empty. The name that should have been on the sign above the door was gone, leaving faint outlines where the letters used to hang. Inside, a man in a janitor's uniform was sweeping. I asked if Halford Creative still rented space there. He looked at me confused. "No, sir. They moved out a few weeks back. Took everything left quick. Did they leave any contact information?" I asked. He shook his head. "None that I know of." I thanked him. He went back to sweeping. The sound of the broom bristles on concrete followed me as I walked outside. The wind picked up, pushing a newspaper across the street. It caught against my leg before sliding away. The headline read, "Trust Matters bold letters, half torn and smudged." I stared at it for a moment before stepping over it. I walked around the block twice, half expecting to find a trace of them. A logo on a window, a note taped to a door. Nothing. Just silence. By late afternoon, I found a motel off the highway. The kind of place that looked the same in every city faded sign, humming neon ice machine, clattering somewhere near the back. I checked in under my own name. The clerk didn't look up when I handed him my card. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke. I turned on the lamp and laid the papers on the desk. The edges had started to curl slightly from the rain. My name stared back at me from the top of each page. Outside, a siren wailed, fading into the distance. A TV from the room next door mumbled a talk show about politics. Somewhere a faucet dripped. I tried calling Ethan again. Straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message this time. I poured another drink, the ice clinking softly in the glass. The liquor burned its way down slow and steady. I looked at my reflection in the dark window and barely recognized the man looking back. The city lights flickered faintly against the glass painting lines across my face, like cracks in old porcelain. For a long time, I stood there without moving. Then I sat on the bed, the papers beside me, the glass in my hand. Through the thin curtain, I saw a man and a little boy walking in the rain. The boy was laughing, jumping into puddles. The father held his hand, but didn't stop him. They passed under a streetlight, their shadows long and fragile on the wet pavement. I kept watching until they disappeared into the gray. The room went quiet again. Only the rain remained steady and soft, washing against the window. I didn't know what I'd find when I saw Ethan. I only knew I had to see him. Not for the money, not even for forgiveness. Just to understand when love had turned into silence. Morning came without light. The motel blinds leaked a dull gray, and the air smelled of wet carpet and cigarettes. I washed my face in the sink water, cold enough to sting, and watched it run down the drain. I felt older than I had the day before, as if the years between Ethan and me had finally caught up. I found his address in an old message thread from years back. A downtown apartment near the river. I drove through light rain past crowded intersections and empty sidewalks past faces that looked both lost and hurried. Chicago had that way of making a man feel invisible. When I reached the building, the intercom was broken. Someone had taped a note beside it that read, "Buzz is dead. Just call up." I didn't have to. Ethan opened the door himself. His face looked thinner, the sharpness in his jaw dulled by fatigue. His eyes flickered with something between surprise and resignation. "Dad," he said quietly. The word hit harder than I expected. I hadn't heard it in 5 years. He stepped aside. The apartment smelled faintly of dust, coffee gone stale, and failure. There were boxes stacked in corners, open and half-packed, as if someone had planned to leave, but never did. "You look tired," I said. He gave a weak smile. "You came all the way here for that." I set the envelope on the table between us. He didn't touch it, just stared at the logo printed on top. "They're saying I owe it," I said. "That we owe it." His hands shook slightly as he opened the flap, scanning the first page, then the second. His face went pale. "I didn't know she changed the terms," he muttered. "Did you read it?" He didn't answer. He looked down, jaw tight, breathing shallow. That silence told me everything. He knew. Maybe not the details, but enough to know there was a risk. "She said it was temporary," he said finally. "Once we got the investor money, we'd pay it off. She said we needed speed." "And you believed her?" He nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, I saw him not as a man, but as the boy who used to bring home broken toys trying to fix them with tape instead of glue. Always rushing, always believing things could be patched without patience. "Where is she now?" I asked. "Gone. Took her things last week." He sat down, hands gripping the table. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic below. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said. "I just wanted to build something, prove I could do it without you. Without me or against me." He flinched at that. I wasn't proud of the way I said it, but the words were already out. He took a deep breath. "I thought if I showed you I could succeed, you'd finally respect me. You've always looked at me like I wasn't enough." That stopped me. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. "You think I didn't respect you?" I said. "You left before I could even explain the truth. About what your mother's trust. It wasn't mine to give or keep. She built it for you to have at 30, so you wouldn't depend on anyone, not even me." He looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "So all those years," he said slowly, "you had the money but just didn't tell me." I nodded. His expression shifted, part realization, part regret. "You could have told me, Dad." "I could have," I said. "But I thought I was teaching you something about earning things yourself. Turns out I taught you how to stop asking." He didn't reply. The room felt smaller. A siren wailed in the distance, stretching the silence thin. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "She said she believed in me. I didn't want to lose that. You didn't lose her, Ethan. You lost yourself trying to keep her." He closed his eyes. For the first time, I saw tears slip down his face, not from shame, but from exhaustion. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You start by not running anymore." I picked up the notice, folded it neatly, and slid it into my jacket. He looked at me, confusion and gratitude tangled in his expression. "You're not going to report me. You're my son, not a criminal. You made a mistake. You'll live with it, and so will I." He swallowed hard. His voice came out a whisper. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not," I said. "But I'm done keeping score." Outside, the rain had thickened into a steady curtain. I stepped out first, the cool air cutting through the stale smell of the apartment. Ethan followed me to the door, hands in his pockets. "Dad." I turned back. He hesitated. "Thank you." I nodded once, then walked toward the car. The sound of rain on metal was steady, rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. The city blurred in the windshield, red lights bleeding into one another as I drove. Each mile felt heavier than the last. Somewhere between the highway exits and the endless drizzle, I realized what had truly broken us. It wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal. It was silence. For years I'd mistaken restraint for strength, thinking a man's love didn't need words, only actions. But silence left long enough turns love into something colder than hate. By the time I crossed back into Michigan, the storm had eased. The sky was bruised with evening light, soft and uncertain. I drove in silence, not searching for forgiveness, but for understanding. Somewhere along that stretch of empty road, I knew one thing for sure: redemption doesn't come through apology. It begins the moment a man decides to stop hiding from what he's done. The wipers squeaked once, clearing a single path through the rain. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, following that thin, fleeting line of clarity, wondering if it would hold long enough to lead me home. The wipers kept time until the rain thinned to a mist. By the time I crossed into town, the clouds had lifted, leaving the streets washed and still. I pulled into my driveway, sat there with the engine ticking, and listened to the quiet settle over the house. The little line of clarity I had followed through the storm had brought me home, but it had not brought answers. I called Mark O'Leary that afternoon. He was the kind of lawyer who wore scuffed shoes with a good suit, a man who knew the difference between noise and proof. His office sat over a diner that still smelled like bacon at 3 in the afternoon. A fan turned lazily on the ceiling. Files were stacked in neat towers along the wall. He read the contract first, lips pressed thin. Then he opened his laptop, blue light climbing the lines of his face. He asked a few questions in a voice that belonged to someone who had heard every kind of story and did not judge any of them. When I finished, he nodded once and started typing. We worked past sunset. He traced Clara's name through corporate registries and business filings, each click another step into a darker corridor. The same names kept returning in different orders. A landlord in River North, a company in Delaware with no employees, a digital marketing agency that had changed addresses 3 times in a year. He followed the trail until it circled a shell company with a single cell number and a mailbox suite. He leaned back and rubbed his eyes. "She is moving money through paper walls," he said. "That loan of yours is not standing alone." He made 2 calls. One to a contact at the bank's fraud unit. One to a friend at the United States Attorney's Office who asked for a copy of the contract and the email log. Mark printed what he could and scanned the rest. The printer coughed out pages that smelled like warm ink. He slid a stack toward me and tapped the corner to square it. "Go home," he said. "Keep your phone on. This is going to move." The call from the agents came the next morning. 2 of them met us at Mark's office. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Their questions were short and exact, touching every place the paper had left a mark. When I described the night I signed, one of them wrote 3 words in a notebook and underlined the last. Digital session record. They asked about Ethan. I told the truth. He is not a con man. He is a son who wanted to be seen. The older agent listened without looking away. He thanked me and asked for my copies of the emails. When we finished, he gathered the papers in a careful stack and slid them into a brown envelope. He said they would be in touch. 2 days later, Ethan called. His voice was thin. The agents had visited him in Chicago. He said they were polite. He said they had questions about Clara and about accounts he did not understand. I listened to him breathe and heard the scrape of a chair on tile. He said he felt sick. I told him to call Mark. He said he would. The next week moved strangely. Fast in the day, slow at night. Mark kept a narrow window on his screen with a table of transactions that did not line up. Money left one account and arrived in another with a name that differed by a single letter. In between sat a third account that existed just long enough to pass it on. The agents called again. They asked me to come downtown to give a formal statement. The federal building sat quiet behind glass that reflected a pale winter sky. The hall smelled like paper and coffee. I sat in a room with a table and 2 chairs and answered the same questions again. When I finished, the younger agent slid a recorder into a drawer and thanked me for my time. He asked if I wanted water. I said no. My hands were steady. My chest was not. They brought Ethan in the next day. He walked past me without looking up, a man who knew the floor was safer than anyone's eyes. Mark placed a hand on his arm and spoke low as they disappeared down the hall. I waited in a chair outside, watching a wall clock count thin seconds. The sound it made was soft, but relentless. When they came out, Ethan looked like he had left something behind. He sat next to me and laced his fingers together, squeezing until the knuckles paled. Mark said the agents believed Clara had used the timing of his trust to wash money through fake accounts. He said they thought Ethan had helped, without knowing he was helping. They called it unwitting. He said that word twice, as if he wanted it to sink in. There was an arrest 2 mornings later. I did not see it. I only saw the news photo that afternoon. Clara's face turned slightly away from the camera. Hair, neat eyes, calm hands cuffed at her back. The caption said, "Federal charges." The article said conspiracy and wire fraud and money laundering. The words looked cold, even in black ink. The hearing came quick. The courtroom was high and hushed, the wood worn smooth by years of hands. A flag stood beside the bench. The air was cool enough that I could see the breath of the man seated 2 rows ahead when he exhaled slowly. I sat behind the rail and watched the door open and close as people entered in careful clothes. Clara stood at the defense table. She did not look at me at first. When she finally did, it was like a hand testing the temperature of the room. Her eyes found mine and held a second longer than necessary. There was no plea in them. Just a cool calculation that said she had already moved on to the next step. Ethan sat with Mark at a smaller table, a single sheet of paper in front of him. He kept his gaze down like a man reading a prayer he did not deserve. The judge entered, and the room rose and sat. The prosecutor outlined what they believed had happened in a voice that carried without effort. The trail of transfers, the shell accounts, the way legitimate funds from the trust had been commingled with dirty money as it passed through front companies. The words were tight and clean. Mark stood when it was his turn. He did not argue what could not be argued. He spoke of Ethan as a man who had been used because he wanted to be worthy. He said responsibility would be taken. He asked that the court see the difference between greed and need. They called me as a witness. I walked to the stand and raised my right hand and felt the strangeness of the moment sink into my bones. The prosecutor asked about the night I signed. I told him what I remembered. The blue light of the screen, the cursor waiting by my name, the small electronic tone that followed the click. He asked what kind of man my son was. I kept my hands folded to keep them from shaking. I said he had made mistakes out of love, not out of hunger. I said he had wanted to be seen and had chosen the wrong eyes to look into. The room was so quiet that I could hear the scratch of a pen 2 rows back. When I stepped down, Clara glanced over the hint of a smile on one corner of her mouth. She spoke to her attorney without moving her lips. As the marshals led her out, she turned her head just enough to let me hear a whisper meant for me alone. "You raised him too trusting." The words were soft, almost kind. They landed like a stone. The judge recessed. People stood and drifted into the corridor, murmuring in voices that seemed to understand what had been decided even before it was said. We waited there under fluorescent lights that flattened every color. Mark spoke with the prosecutor near a drinking fountain. Ethan leaned against the wall with his hands in his pockets, shoulders bent in a shape I recognized from years ago. When the hearing resumed, the offer was on the table. The government would not ask for prison if Ethan agreed to restitution supervision and cooperation. It was not mercy. It was arithmetic. Mark told him quietly to take it. Ethan nodded without lifting his eyes. It was over in a handful of sentences that fit neatly into the record. The gavel touched wood. Papers were gathered. Chairs scraped. The bailiff opened the door. Ethan stood, but did not turn toward me. I stepped close enough to feel the heat off his coat. I put my hand on his shoulder. He did not look up. I could feel the tremor in the muscle beneath my palm, a small, unsteady beat that was not fear and not relief, something in between. Justice is not always punishment," I said. "Sometimes it is responsibility." He nodded once. The motion was small. It felt like the first honest thing either of us had managed in a long time. On the courthouse steps, the air smelled like snow, though the sky held only a thin light. People moved past in hushed lines, their shoes ticking on the stone. A city bus sighed at the curb and pulled away. I stood there with my hand still warm from his shoulder and watched the wind lift a scrap of paper along the railing. It climbed a step, faltered, and settled in the shadow where the stone met the iron. Snow came late that year, a thin dusting that softened everything it touched. It clung to rooftops and fences, but never stayed long, as if even winter had grown tired. I shoveled a narrow path to the garage, the metal scraping a slow rhythm on the concrete. The sound steadied me the way repetition can when words no longer do. Inside, the air smelled of oil and wood shavings. The clock on the wall clicked its hands, inching through another quiet afternoon. I spent most of my days at the community workshop in Detroit, teaching young men how to rebuild engines. They came with worn faces and new probation papers, men who had already learned the price of quick mistakes. Some carried anger like armor. Others hid behind silence. I showed them what my father once showed me, how patience turns chaos into order. You start with a mess of parts, all cold and useless. You clean each one, line them up, and bring them back to life one bolt at a time. There was Marcus, whose hands shook at first, but grew steady with each turn of the wrench. There was Andre, who never spoke until an engine caught and ran smooth, then smiled like he'd heard forgiveness. And Luis, who once whispered that machines were the only thing that didn't lie. Helping them rebuild engines felt like helping myself rebuild faith. Every spark that caught every hum of a fixed motor was a small answer to the noise I used to carry. Evenings were quieter. Cooper slept near the heater, his fur silvering with time. I wrote checks at the kitchen table, the lamp throwing a warm circle of light. Each envelope I sealed was both a burden and a release. Every month, I sent one off to the bank, watching the debt shrink grain by grain. Sometimes when I turned off the lights, I'd glance at the clock before heading to bed. It still ticked like it always had, but the sound was softer now, more like a heartbeat than a countdown. A year passed this way, then another. I heard from Ethan through my lawyer, first short notes about progress restitution rebuilding. Then one evening, his own message appeared on my phone. Working, paying, trying to stay right. I typed replies and deleted them more than once. Words never seemed enough, or maybe too much. In early December, I had a dream. I was standing in the old house, the one Ethan grew up in, but every door was locked. I could hear him inside calling my name, but my hands wouldn't turn the knobs. I woke with my heart pounding, the sound of the wind in the chimney fading into silence. I didn't believe in omens, but that morning I called his number. It rang until it stopped. No voicemail. Nothing. For days, the silence stayed heavy as ice. Then a week before Christmas, the mail came early. The carrier's boots left small half-moons in the snow along the porch. I brought the stack inside and set it on the counter. Bills, a catalog, an envelope from the bank. I almost didn't open it. The flap tore clean with a soft hiss. Loan paid in full. Sender E. Halford, Chicago. I read the words once, then again. My hands trembled not from cold, but from something that felt like release. I leaned against the counter and let the moment breathe. That evening I went out to the garage. The snow outside reflected the porch light, faint and steady. I placed the letter on the workbench under the lamp. Cooper raised his head and gave one quiet thump of his tail. I smiled at him and set my hand on the paper, feeling its weight, its finality. The clock above the tool rack ticked the same as ever, but I heard something new in it. Not waiting, not loss, just time moving as it should. The phone rang. I dried my hands and answered. Dad. The voice was steady, careful, older. I paid it off, he said. I wanted to make it right. You already have, I said. He breathed softly, almost a laugh, and the silence that followed wasn't the kind that hurt. It felt open wide like a door left ajar to let in the light. How's work, I asked. Hard, he said, but good. I'm learning. Trying to run lean. Keep at it. We let the quiet fill in again. Outside, snow began to fall in long, slow flakes that caught in the porch light. Somewhere a distant engine started steady and low, the sound drifting through the night like a promise. I told him to take care. He said he would. The line clicked, and I stood there for a while, listening to the soft hum of the heater to the steady tick of the clock. Later I returned to the garage. I unrolled the tarp over a small block engine I had been rebuilding with the boys at the shop. I wiped my hands, fitted the torque wrench, and went bolt to bolt quarter turns until the pressure felt right. When I was done, I placed both palms on the valve cover and closed my eyes. The metal was cool, but beneath it was something alive waiting. Outside, the street was still. A plow passed somewhere far off, the scrape faint and even. I looked through the window and saw the faint glow of the workshop down the block. In the reflection of the glass, my own face looked older but lighter. For the first time in years, I saw no shadow standing behind me. The heater clicked off, leaving only the sound of wind and the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves. I turned off the lamp, leaving the letter on the bench, its white corner catching what little light remained. The clock ticked once more, then another slow and certain marking, not the end of something, but its return. I stayed a moment longer at the window, then turned and made my way down the hall, the boards soft beneath my feet, the night still and kind, the air carrying the faint scent of oil and winter. The world outside was quiet, but not empty. It was the quiet of a life mended by hand. The house settled as I moved down the hall boards, giving a soft sigh under my feet. In the kitchen, the window held a small square of winter sky, pale and still, the kind that promises more snow before dawn. I rinsed the coffee cup and set it mouth down on the rack, then stood with my hand on the back of the chair until the warmth faded. The clock ticked with its softer beat, not a warning anymore, only time keeping even pace. New Year's Eve came quiet to the neighborhood. A few strings of lights still hung from eaves along the block, their glow a tired amber against the cold. I pulled on my coat and stepped into the garage. The air smelled of oil and pine where I had sanded a shelf for the workbench. Dust swam in the cone of the lamp, moving slow as snow underwater. Cooper followed, lay by the heater, and let out one long breath. I set the phone on the bench and scrolled through old messages. Years of silence held inside small icons and timestamps. I pressed and pressed again until they were gone. The emptiness that followed did not scare me. It felt like a room finally cleared light, able to reach the floor again. I lifted the phone, held it near my mouth, and recorded a new message. The words came low and even, the way a man speaks when he has nothing left to hide. "I forgive you, son." I played it back once, listening to my own voice as if it belonged to someone I had been waiting to meet. I set the phone beside the letter on the bench and rested both hands on the wood. The heater hummed. Outside, a car passed slow on the street tires, whispering over packed snow. When the sound faded, the workshop returned to its old breathing quiet and sure. For a moment I heard Mary the way I used to in the morning when the light came through the curtain edge. "You did what was right, John. Not scold, not sermon, only the kind of sentence that makes a man stand a little straighter." I reached for the small maple box on the shelf and opened it. Inside lay the brass nameplate I had never mounted on the garage door. Halford stamped deep. My thumb found the grooves and followed them like a road I could walk without getting lost. I turned off the lamp and went back into the house. The living room held its soft blue from the television screen, though the sound was muted. A college bowl game flickered in silence. Two teams I did not follow moved across a field far from here. I clicked it off and listened to the furnace roll another belt of warm air through the vents. It smelled faintly of dust and winter clean and used like a church after Sunday service. The phone chimed. A message came through with a single photo and a short line of text. I opened it and stood still. Ethan had taken the shot from the sidewalk at dusk. A narrow storefront with fresh glass and new paint. A light over the door. Inside, a work light hung over a scarred bench sockets, lined small to large. On the window in clean white script, Halford Engineering rebuilt from scratch. The words sat like a steady hand on the shoulder. My breath left slow and even, the way it does when a weight gets set down after too long. I took in every small thing. The floor painted a gray that would take the light well. The pegboard hung straight with outlines traced for each tool. A stool near the press where a man could sit and think without feeling idle. The kind of order that comes only after you have lived through disorder and learned to choose against it. Another line came through. "Opening day soon. Come by if you want." No push, no plea, only an open door set at a gentle angle. I typed a reply and erased it, then typed again. "Proud of you. I will make the drive when the roads are good." I pressed send and stood with the phone warm in my hand. Near midnight, the town shifted. Somewhere 2 streets over, a cheer went up and faded. A bottle cracked against a curb. A porch light blinked twice and went steady. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside. The air held that sharp clean that comes before a new snow. The world smelled of metal and cold bark, of smoke thin as thread. I walked to the end of the driveway and looked down the block. The houses were dark except for one window where a child moved past, small and quick, a shadow caught by a lamp. I drove to the diner on Gratiot that stays open late on holidays, a place where the friars whisper and the coffee never grows weaker, no matter how long it stands. Only 2 booths were filled. A young couple bent over a plate of pie, and a man in a work jacket ate eggs, as if they might leave without him. I took a stool at the counter. The waitress nodded and poured. The steam rose and carried a smell that reached back years, and then returned to the cup in my hand, present and simple. I did not stay long. I left cash under the saucer, stepped back into the cold, and felt the wind skate across my face and wake me in a way sleep does not. At home, I went again to the garage. The letter lay where I had left it, white edge bright under the lamp. I propped the phone upright against a socket set and pressed play on the outgoing message. "I forgive you, son." The words filled the small room and settled like clean snow on an unmarked lot. They did not erase anything. They did not need to. They made a path. I sat on the stool and let my hands hang open between my knees. The last 2 years gathered into one picture I could hold without shaking. The boys at the workshop leaning over an open block breath, fogging in winter air. The monthly checks lined in a ledger that no longer scolded. The courthouse wood worn smooth by palms of people who had stood when the judge entered and hoped to walk out lighter than they came in. The photo of a small new shop on a Chicago street with my family name written steady across its glass. The phone chimed again. I looked and saw a second photo, this one from inside. A close shot of a hand placing a small sign on the wall near the clock. "Do the small things right." The hand was Ethan's. A scar I knew cut a pale line across the knuckle where a Little League foul tip had found him. I let the image hold me for a breath, then set the phone face down and closed my eyes. When I opened them, I took the maple box once more and set the brass nameplate on the bench. I found the small screws in the drawer, the ones I had sorted by size on a heavy winter afternoon when the wind would not stop. I drilled pilot holes and turned the screws in slow so the wood would not split, the plate seated flush and true. I stepped back and looked, Halford steady as if it had always been there. Snow began fine, and even each flake catching the light from the small window above the bench. I shut off the heater and listened. The garage cooled the way a lake does after sunset, no rush, only release. I stood and took one last slow look around. The sockets lined like notes on a staff. The wrenches wiped clean and hung with their backs to the wall. The letter flat and safe under the lamp. I carried the phone to the doorway and paused. From here, I could hear the refrigerator cycle in the kitchen and the soft wheeze in Cooper's sleep. Down the block, a car turned a corner and worked up the hill tires, finding grip engine low and confident. The sound climbed, eased, and slipped away, leaving the kind of hush that makes your shoulders drop. I clicked off the lamp and stepped into the house. In the living room, I sat on the edge of the chair and let the dark settle. The clock kept its calm beat. The furnace lifted a little warmth and set it down across the floor. I thought of the boy who had left, and the man who had called, and how both of them were my son, and how both of them were on their way. Outside, the snow fell without hurry and covered the marks of the day. I lay the phone on the table and did not touch it again. In the window, the night held a pale blue, the kind that arrives just before first light. And in that color I heard a small sound begin the sound of a quiet engine far off, steady and sure moving toward morning.